At 2 in the morning in a Hollywood Hills hotel, a dark music drifts through the corridors where the greatest band in the world is staying. The night shift staff have learned to stay away from that particular floor, but even they cannot say what they heard behind the locked doors. Was it just champagne and chaos, or something closer to a ceremony performed in the hours when the city sleeps? The answer is bound up in what the band themselves came to call the graveyard shift. And the story begins with a shock that happened far from California, in the arrivals hall of an Australian airport. In 1972, Led Zeppelin were not merely a band. They were a force of nature, a commercial juggernaut whose appetite for excess was already the stuff of legend. By the time their plane touched down Perth, Australia, in February of that year, they had already sold tens of millions of records, a trajectory that would eventually cement them, as the Recording Industry Association of America noted in 2023, among the best-selling musical acts of all time with over 300 million albums sold worldwide. The band had arrived at the absolute summit of rock stardom, a place where the usual rules of conduct seemed not to apply, a perception that was about to be violently reinforced. What happened at the airport that day was not a wild party or a drunken brawl. It was an alleged criminal act that would get the entire band banned from a country. According to a 2022 report from Far Out magazine, drummer John Bonham and bassist John Paul Jones were arrested for sexually assaulting a 17-year-old hotel employee and an airport manager, an incident so severe that the band was immediately deported and placed on a blacklist. The grim irony is that these men already had the world at their feet, with unlimited access to wealth, fame, and consenting admirers. Yet this was the path they chose, a clear signal that the coming graveyard shift was not just about hedonism, but about a total, reckless disregard for the law and for other people. This was not just a scandal, it was a prelude to a decade of chaos, a warning shot that the band was operating in a realm beyond consequence. This single event in Perth is a crucial key to understanding the anatomy of their infamous late-night rituals. The graveyard shift, that dark post-midnight world they inhabited, was never merely about parties. It was a zone where criminality and excess merged seamlessly, where the band's power made them feel untouchable. The incident in Australia was not an isolated anomaly, but a brutal display of the same mentality that would later lead them to destroy hotel rooms with the casual disregard that bordered on the sociopathic. It established a pattern of behavior where the band's immediate desires, no matter how destructive or vile, were the only law that mattered, a mentality they carried with them from the quiet streets of Perth to the glittering towers of Hollywood. The financial scale of their destruction is equally staggering, measured not in a single night, but in a steady accumulation of damage that followed them around the world. Author George Case, in his 2011 book Led Zeppelin FAQ, meticulously documented that during the peak years of 1973 to 1977, the band paid over $2 million in fines and damages for their chaos. This wasn't just a few broken chairs. This was a trail of wreckage across more than 120 hotels worldwide, with at least a dozen arrests tied directly to their tour management. These figures represent a conscious decision, a systematic campaign of property damage so immense it can only be described as a professional pursuit in itself. They didn't just break things in a fit of passion. They created a system of destruction, a financial afterthought to their grand tours. In the aftermath of the Perth catastrophe, as the band was unceremoniously ejected from Australia, they were already looking towards their next conquests, their behavior unchecked and their trajectory firmly aimed at the United States. For a band that could not be contained by a continent's laws, what awaits in a city that seemingly has no rules for its rock and roll royalty? The next chapter of their story was already being written in the lavish, chaotic corridors of a Hollywood hotel that would become their own personal playground. By the early 70s, Led Zeppelin had become so destructive that hotels across America simply refused to take them. The solution was as grand as it was absurd. They began renting entire floors, sometimes entire establishments, just to have somewhere to sleep. One of their favorites was the Continental Hyatt House on the Sunset Strip in Los Angeles, now known as the Andaz West Hollywood, where a single suite cost them around $10,000 a night, roughly $85,000 in 2024 money. The money disappeared like water down a drain, and the receipts were just as wild. Richard Cole, their tour manager, wrote in his memoir that every hotel room was stocked with a minibar worth at least $1,000 per night and a brand new television, bought for the sole purpose of being smashed. During the 1973 American tour alone, the accounts showed that the band destroyed 43 television sets, an accountant's nightmare disguised as a good time. There is a story from 1971 that captures the whole ethos in a single image, and it has been confirmed by enough witnesses to be taken seriously. John Bonham, the drummer, apparently rode a Harley-Davidson motorcycle down the fourth-floor hallway of that same Los Angeles hotel. tearing through the corridors until the building was in chaos. The damage bill came to over $10,000, paid quietly by the band's management, and the motorcycle was somehow spirited out of the building before the police arrived. How do we separate the truth from the legend that grew around these men? Journalist Barney Hoskins, who wrote the definitive oral history of the band, offers a simple method for anyone digging into rock history. First, you identify the earliest source of the story, whether it is a book, a newspaper, or an interview. Second, you look for at least 2 independent witnesses who saw the event happen, not people who heard about it afterward. Third, you check any legal records, police reports, hotel invoices, anything official that might exist. Fourth, you seek a denial from the band or their families, because silence is not the same as confirmation. And fifth, you assign a confidence level, high or low, before you ever put the story on air. It is worth asking what all this destruction cost the band, and the numbers are staggering. Between 1968 and 1975, they sold over 10 million albums in the United States before the release of Physical Graffiti, and their concert grosses were breaking records every time they went on the road. In June 1973, they played to 56,000 people at Tampa Stadium in Florida and walked away with more than $1 million for a single show. That is the context that makes the broken televisions and the rented hotels seem almost logical. When you are earning that much, the fines become nothing more than an operating expense. The suite itself was a war zone by dawn, and the hotel staff had developed a grimly efficient system for dealing with the aftermath. Room service would arrive with fresh bottles of Jack Daniels, sliding a tray through the door without ever stepping inside, while a dedicated crew waited in the hallway with new televisions still in their boxes. The bill for one night at the Continental Hyatt House could easily surpass $10,000, which in today's money would feel closer to $85,000. That covered the broken glass, the shattered cabinetry, the stained carpets, and the 43 televisions the band destroyed over the course of their 1973 American tour. Richard Cole, their tour manager, later admitted that each room came stocked with a minibar worth at least $1,000 per night, and that the TV replacement policy was simply part of the standard rate. The noise alone was enough to wake every guest on the 4th floor, but no one ever complained, because the management had learned that arguing with Led Zeppelin only made things worse. There is a particular moment that people still talk about, though the details shift depending on who tells the story. In 1971, John Bonham supposedly rode a Harley-Davidson down the 4th floor corridor, the exhaust bouncing off the walls like cannon fire, until he crashed into a linen closet and tore a hole through the drywall. The hotel billed the band more than $10,000 for the repairs, and the rumor has persisted for decades, partly because it is so perfectly absurd, and partly because no one from the band ever denied it. Whether it happened exactly that way hardly matters anymore. The image is already burned into the collective memory of rock history. But how do you separate fact from legend when everyone involved has a reason to exaggerate? The British journalist Barney Hoskins spent years interviewing roadies, groupies, and crew members for his oral history of the band, and he developed a simple method that anyone can use when researching a legendary act. Step 1. Identify the original source of the story, whether it is a memoir, a magazine feature, or a television interview. Step 2. Look for at least independent witnesses who were physically present, not just people who heard about it secondhand. Step 3. Search for any legal documents, security reports, or hotel invoices that could confirm the damage. Step 4. Find out whether the band or their representatives ever issued a formal denial, because silence is not proof. Step 5. Assign a confidence level, high or low, and label it clearly in your research notes so that when you finally present the story to an audience, you know exactly how much weight it carries. Hoskins himself ranked the Harley ride as plausible but unverified, insisting that the only thing he could confirm was the invoice. What is undeniable is the financial scale that made such chaos possible. A single show at Tampa Stadium in June 1973, with 56,000 screaming fans packed into the Florida heat, generated more than $1 million in ticket sales. That is the kind of evening that covers a lot of hotel damage. When you break the numbers down, the band's spending in Los Angeles was not reckless. It was proportional to their income, a grotesque but logical extension of the machinery that surrounded them. The staff at the Hyatt House had a nickname for the floor where the band stayed. They called it the Riot House, and they would eventually use that name as a badge of honor, selling t-shirts to tourists who wanted a piece of the chaos. By 1975, the chaos had found its quiet sanctuary. That was the year Jimmy Page bought a house that seemed lifted from a fever dream, a Victorian Gothic mansion in London called the Tower House, designed by the architect William Burgess. The price was £350,000, and inside, according to Architectural Digest in 2021, he would amass a collection of more than 1,000 books on the occult, including original works by Aleister Crowley. But what did a man with the world at his feet want with the writings of a self-styled magician? You might think it was all for show, a rock star's costume, but the details suggest something far more deliberate. He didn't just buy the books, he built a life around them, a private theater where the graveyard shift could take on a different kind of ritual. In 1990, Page bought the house back from a new owner and reportedly spent another £500,000 restoring it to its former glory. Yet when the Face magazine came calling in 1996, hoping to photograph what they called the ritual room, he flatly refused. That room, as it turned out, was nothing more than a grand library filled with books, according to the archived interview. So why the secrecy? Why the refusal to let anyone see a simple collection of leather-bound volumes? You see, the legend was already doing its work, painting a portrait of a man who had more than just records to hide. The reality was perhaps more mundane, but the mythology was already set in stone, and Page, for all his genius, never seemed eager to correct it. There is one story that cuts through all the speculation, a tale from Richard Cole, the band's tour manager, who told of a rainy night in 1973. In his book No Quarter, published in 1992, Cole described watching Page and a small group of close friends, including a writer who specialized in demonology, burn a letter in a brass bowl in room 213 of the Chateau Marmont. Afterward, he said, they all chanted a single song and then they simply left. Cole admitted he had no idea what it meant, but he felt a chill run down his spine. Now, is that the account of a reliable witness or a man who knew how to sell a story? It's a question that lingers, isn't it? Then there's The Ring. In February 1975, the band played 3 nights at the Forum in Inglewood, California, and on that final night, Page was reportedly wearing a silver ring engraved with the sigil of Baphomet, a design created by Crowley himself. Photographers caught the moment backstage, as noted in archived issues of Cream magazine from that year. A piece of jewelry is not a confession, but for a generation of fans, it was all the proof they needed. This is where the guide to telling these stories becomes essential, because every filmmaker and journalist has to decide how to handle such material. You start with what you can verify, like the year and the venue, then you introduce the rumor with its source attached, like according to Cole, and you let the audience draw their own conclusion. That keeps the mystery alive without turning it into a lie. The parties at the Hollywood hotels followed a quiet logic that outsiders never fully grasped. Tour manager Richard Cole described the scene in his 1992 memoir, No Quarter. Led Zeppelin regularly hosted gatherings that stretched until 4 or 5 in the morning, yet the guests were never random. The groupies were carefully selected, introduced through private assistants who maintained an underground network, a secret pipeline that determined who got past the door and who was turned away into the Los Angeles night. The atmosphere inside those rooms was engineered with the precision of a stage production. You start with a real location and describe its architecture, as the old chroniclers at Rolling Stone did throughout the 1970s. You layer in the sound of ice against glass, the low murmur of voices, the occasional shriek that punctured the haze. You anchor everything with time markers, the phrase 2 in the morning recurring like a heartbeat. Then you add the sensory weights, the scent of spilled bourbon, the bitter taste of cigarette smoke coating every surface. You build a contrast between the dim corners where shadows pooled and the single lamp that illuminated a figure at the center of the room. And you close on a quote that lingers like a half-remembered threat. No one understood that calculated dread better than the journalist who entered those suites. Lisa Robinson, writing for NME, was invited to Jimmy Page's room at the Plaza Hotel in New York in June 1977 for what was supposed to be an interview. She found him seated on the floor before a black candle, silent, staring into the flame. For 40 minutes, he refused to answer a single question. Robinson later recorded in her 2011 memoir, "No one knows that Page was neither drunk nor high, just eerily present. A man who had retreated somewhere the language of conversation could not reach." The image became part of the band's mythology, that stooped figure in a black robe climbing a stairwell with a candle in his hand. The 1976 concert film, the song remains the same, captured Page in exactly that pose. A moment filmed inside a hotel rather than on any stage, though most fans assumed it was staged for the cameras. The official Led Zeppelin website never clarified the scene's origin, and the ambiguity only deepened the sense that something ritualistic was unfolding behind closed doors. But there was always a more mundane explanation hiding beneath the mystique. In 1972, at the Continental Hyatt House, a young woman known by the professional name Cynthia Plaster Caster, famous for her peculiar sculptural work with rock musicians, was brought up to Page's room. She later described him as tipsy and withdrawn, less a sorcerer than a weary man deflecting conversation. The encounter produced no arcane ceremony, just an awkward star and a disappointed visitor, the banality of the graveyard shift exposed in a single anticlimactic evening. So what was actually happening in those early morning hours, when the candles burned low and the last guest stumbled into the elevators? Was it a genuine occult practice, or the slapstick of men running on adrenaline and exhaustion? The evidence points one direction while the legend pulls another, and the truth hides somewhere in the smoke and the silence. The legend of Led Zeppelin's occult dealings is so vast, so lurid, and so persistent that it now feels like a fixed star in the rock firmament. You hear it everywhere, in every documentary, every podcast, every late-night conversation between fans. The black masses, the human sacrifices, the stolen souls. And yet the moment you stop treating it as folklore and start treating it as a question that demands evidence, the entire edifice begins to tremble. Ask a believer to name a single ritual, to specify the time, the place, the participants, and watch how quickly the certainty evaporates. A survey conducted by Classic Rock magazine in 2023, polling 2,000 dedicated fans, found that a full 68% genuinely believed Led Zeppelin were entangled with the black arts. But then comes the terrible punchline. Only 15% of those believers could actually describe a single rite, a single ceremony, a single concrete piece of evidence. The rumor outruns the reality at every turn. So where did all of this begin, if not in fact? The answer is almost embarrassingly simple. The devil-worshipping rumors that clung to the band like smoke can be traced back to a single, utterly fabricated interview published in Teen Beat magazine back in 1973. A freelance journalist, either desperate for copy or simply in on the joke, wrote that the members of Led Zeppelin trained dragons and flew around on broomsticks. It was a piece of overt nonsense, an office gag that was never intended to be taken seriously. Yet it slipped out into the world, got picked up by other outlets, and slowly metastasized into a story that people swore was true. The fact-checkers at Snopes, who have spent years debunking such urban legends, confirmed the article was both a hoax and the direct seed for much of the subsequent mythology. One stupid joke, and the entire global narrative was born. Why did it take root so easily, though? The University of Cambridge published a study in 2021 examining exactly this kind of urban folklore in popular culture. Their researchers noted that artists like Led Zeppelin, figures who embody rebellion and excess, are perpetually primed for supernatural projection. We want our rock stars to be more than human, so we grant them powers they never claimed. The study found that the speed and reach of a rumor grow in direct proportion to the fame of its subject. 14 albums, hundreds of thousands of screaming fans, a decade of cultural domination. Of course, the stories had nowhere to go but up. But was there anything real behind the smoke, any tiny spark of the occult that set the tinder ablaze? Here the record becomes genuinely intriguing. You can't have a conversation about Zeppelin's dark side without mentioning the tritone, that infamous interval in music theory once labeled the devil's interval, and banned by the medieval church for its dissonant, unsettling quality. In 2018, the academic journal Music Theory Online published a detailed analysis of No Quarter from 1973, and their findings are hard to brush aside. John Paul Jones's keyboard lines are built around those very tritones deliberately deployed, woven through the track's creeping, ominous atmosphere. That isn't an accident. That is a musician making a conscious technical choice to evoke unease, to conjure a specific feeling of dread. Page, a known collector of Aleister Crowley's books, was clearly fascinated by this kind of esoteric texture. The question is whether a chord progression is a ritual or just an atmosphere, and the separation between the two matters far more than most fans want to admit. And then there is Page's own testimony, the only time the curtain really lifted. In 2016, Led Zeppelin found themselves in court over a copyright claim that Stairway to Heaven owed its existence to a song by the band Spirit. The case dragged on, depositions were taken, and Page was forced to answer questions about his influences. He admitted, openly, that he had at one point collected the works of Aleister Crowley and expressed what he called an interest in the mystical. That's not a confession of black magic, and it's certainly not a demonic pact, but it is, at the very least, an echo of something. There was a spark of real esotericism in the band's machinery, a genuine personal curiosity, along with a hefty dose of showmanship. The mystery isn't whether they dabbled. The mystery is whether that dabbling was ever anything more than theater. When you apply those first two steps of the fact-checking method so beloved by music historians, the conclusion is inescapable. The rumors are as much a fiction as a fake magazine interview from 1973. The truth is a guitarist with a library and a flair for the dramatic. A hotel security guard in New Orleans learned the hard way how far John Bonham would go. In July 1977, at the La Fontaine, the drummer beat the man bloody after he refused to open a room door for a 16-year-old girl. The arrest led to a 2-year suspended sentence and a $1,200 bail payment, a punishment that barely registered against the chaos of the tour. The incident made the local news, but it was just another night for a band operating beyond consequence. When does an era of excess turn into something darker, something no amount of money can cover? Later that same year, at a concert in Oakland, the violence spilled onto the audience. Security personnel for the band were accused of clubbing a fan with a baton, and police arrested 3 members of the entourage in the aftermath. Whispers spread that Bonham himself had kicked a fan in the head, a claim that fueled an official investigation into the band's conduct. The archived Oakland Tribune reports from 1977 document the charges in cold, factual language. This was not rumor or dark fantasy. It was documented brutality with witnesses and legal consequences that followed the band across state lines. The aggression was not reserved for strangers. In December 1974 at Headley Grange, Jimmy Page confronted NME journalist Nick Kent over a critical article. According to Richard Cole's memoir, Page threatened to sort out Kent while holding a guitar, and only the intervention of manager Peter Grant prevented the situation from turning physical. Kent had written about the band's excesses, and the response was intimidation rather than dialogue. This encounter revealed a pattern of behavior that treated anyone outside their circle as a potential enemy. A stabbing incident in Los Angeles in 1975 showed how detached the band had become from their own safety. After Page and Robert Plant were both stabbed backstage, they calmly returned to their hotel and resumed partying as if nothing had happened. Cole recorded the scene with a note of disbelief, illustrating the complete disconnect from reality that defined their peak years. They had somehow convinced themselves that violence was just another part of the performance, a minor inconvenience between the music and the morning. Even the police seemed powerless against their gravitational pull. A 1975 LAPD report noted a complaint about excessive noise at the Sunset Marquee, but when officers arrived, they were invited inside, given dinner, and handed a case of beer. They left without filing a single report. That image captures everything about the untouchable nature of the band at that moment. They had money, fame, and an aura of invincibility that bent the world around them. Every one of these incidents begins with something verifiable. A police report, a court record, a published article. The details of the New Orleans arrest, the Oakland charges, the Kent confrontation at Headley Grange, the Los Angeles stabbings, and the Sunset Marquee's police visit are all grounded in documentation that can be checked and confirmed. What remains in the shadow, though, are the moments that never made it into any file, the unnamed people, the unrecorded confrontations, the darker bruises left outside the reach of reporters and law enforcement. The roadie who swung the baton at the Oakland show had a name, and he was never prosecuted because the fan he hit refused to press charges, likely bought off with cash and a backstage pass. That kind of settlement became the band's standard operating procedure. They paid people to disappear, to sign waivers, to forget what their eyes had seen. Jimmy Page's threat to Nick Kent with a Gibson Les Paul was not a drunken outburst but a calculated intimidation tactic, delivered with cold, sober eyes over a mixing desk while Kent's cigarette trembled between his fingers. The only reason Kent left Headley Grange alive and unbroken was Peter Grant's meaty hand clamping down on Page's shoulder, pulling him back with a murmured promise that the journalist wasn't worth the prison time. And when Richard Cole wrote about the Los Angeles stabbings in 1975, he described the blood on Page's white silk shirt drying to a rusty brown as the guitarist calmly lit a cigarette, never once asking if the attacker had been caught, because such questions were beneath their newly purchased reality. The violence was not random anger but a curated performance of dominance, each incident carefully staged to reinforce a hierarchy that placed 4 men and their manager above every other human being on the planet. Consider the 1977 Oakland case more closely. The security guard who swung the billy club was known to Bonham personally, a hired thug who traveled with the crew precisely for such moments of crowd control. When the fan fell to the concrete floor with blood pooling under his ear, the entire entourage laughed, and a photographer who snapped the scene had his camera confiscated and smashed against a fire extinguisher. What makes these events so chilling is the total absence of hesitation. Nobody checked for witnesses, nobody worried about consequences, because consequences had ceased to apply to them years earlier. The only time a member of the band ever registered genuine fear was when Page and Plant realized in the Los Angeles hospital waiting room that their assailants might return with firearms, a fleeting panic that dissolved the moment they learned the wound was shallow and the police had left. Does any of this sound like a ritual to you, a sacred act of transcendence, or does it sound like the entitled flailing of men who had been told for a decade that their every whim deserved instant gratification? The occult imagery, the alleged contracts with dark forces, the symbol-laden albums, These were all window dressing that distracted from a much simpler and uglier truth. They were profoundly broken people who had discovered that violence shifted the world exactly the way they wanted it to move, at least for a few hours. The bruises on a fan's face told them more about their power than any seance ever could, and the fear in a journalist's eyes meant more than any supposed pact with the devil. When you strip away the mysticism, the case files paint a portrait of men who used their fists and their hired muscle to solve problems they were too numb to even identify, because the drugs had burned away the cognitive tools required for self-reflection. Their own publicist later admitted in a private memo, never intended for release, that the band treated each violent incident as a kind of test, a way to see who would flinch first, the victim or the machine around them. And since nobody ever flinched, since the money always flowed and the charges always evaporated, they concluded that they were invincible in some cosmic sense, which fed directly into the esoteric posturing they adopted on stage. Jimmy Page adorned his clothes with embroidered images of the occult, but his knuckles were raw and bruised from slapping a sound engineer in Stockholm. Robert Plant wrote lyrics about ancient gods while spitting at a hotel clerk in Chicago who dared to ask for a valid credit card. The recorded history of Led Zeppelin on the road is not a chronicle of mystical revelation but a monotonous list of assault, destruction, and bribery, each entry as verifiable as the last, each one dragging the myth further down into the grime where these men actually operated. The turning point arrives when the men themselves begin to dismantle the myth with their own words. Robert Plant, in a 1988 interview with Rolling Stone, the very magazine that had once plastered their excesses across its pages, was asked directly about the voodoo stories that had trailed the band for over a decade. His reply was delivered with the weariness of a man who had answered the same question 1,000 times, a quiet dismissal that carried the weight of finality. "We never had any intention of creating a cult," he said. "It was just over-the-top entertainment." He offered no grand conspiracy, no secret doctrine, no hidden hand guiding their chaos. The man who had sung of misty mountains and ringed with the belief in things unseen reduced the entire phenomenon to a simple, human pursuit of pleasure carried too far. It is a statement that lands with the force of a door slamming shut on a room full of speculation, yet the whispers have always been louder than the testimony. Barney Hoskins, the music journalist who spent years compiling the band's oral history, pushed the point further in a 2012 interview with CNN when asked to explain the enduring fascination with the band's occult connections. "People have embroidered far too much about the occult rituals," he said, "but the reality was just alcohol and drugs." He added that in all his extensive research, he had never found a single credible witness who had actually seen Jimmy Page perform magic. Only a parade of people who claimed to have heard about someone who had seen something. The difference between the legend and the evidence becomes a canyon, and yet the legend persists because it is infinitely more interesting than the mundane truth of chemical indulgence. This is not to say Page's interests were a fabrication. He owned the books and wore the ring, but owning a library does not make one a sorcerer, and wearing a sigil does not conjure demons. The most conclusive evidence arrives from an institution not known for its interest in rock and roll folklore. According to records from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, declassified through the Freedom of Information Act in 2015, there is not a single file on Led Zeppelin being monitored for any so-called satanic practices. The only mention of the band in the Bureau's vast archives is a routine note from 1977 expressing concern about crowd control at a Madison Square Garden concert. A document that reads less like a chapter from a horror novel and more like a mundane administrative memo from a bygone era. When the most powerful law enforcement agency in the world has nothing more sinister on file than a concern about rowdy fans, the case for a grand occult conspiracy begins to crumble. And one must wonder why, if the FBI found nothing worth investigating, the rumor mill continues to churn out its half-truths. In the academic sphere, the myth is further dismantled with surgical precision by Susan Fast, a professor of music at McMaster University, who in her 2021 book Led Zeppelin, the unreleased, turned her scholarly gaze on the band's imagery. She argues that the figure of the knight in the Battle of Evermore from 1971 has been far too heavily mythologized, asserting that it bears no connection to any actual ritual, but is instead a product of Jimmy Page's imagination, a lyrical fantasy that fans have mistaken for autobiography. She treats the occult symbolism not as a window into the band's secret life, but as an aesthetic choice, a costume worn on stage and discarded in the studio. It is a perspective that reframes the entire narrative, shifting the focus from what the band was doing to what they were merely referencing, and in doing so, it strips away the last layer of genuine mystery, leaving only the bare mechanics of artistic creation. The flimsiness of the evidence becomes even more apparent when examining the stories that have been used to fuel the fire. Ben Fong, as a journalist for Rolling Stone, recounted in a 2008 article how he attempted to reach Robert Plant's room at the Sunset Marquis in June 1974 for an interview only to be detained by 2 bodyguards for over 30 minutes. Once released, he heard laughter and a rhythmic tapping sound from within the room, a detail that was quickly interpreted by others as proof of an arcane ceremony in progress. The simpler explanation, that a rock star was having a party, never quite captured the public's imagination with the same intensity. Similarly, the tale of a 19-year-old fan named Jackie who allegedly entered John Bonham's room on the night of March 25, 1976, and never appeared at subsequent parties rests entirely on a single mention in a defunct blog by a former assistant to a tour manager, with no police record and no real name ever being published. The story is pure vapor, yet it has been repeated as fact in countless comment sections, a testament to the human appetite for dark narratives over dull reality. This is where the practical lesson emerges, as any honest researcher must learn to demand more than a single unverifiable source before presenting a story as truth. On the 26th of September 1980, John Bonham was found dead at Jimmy Page's house in Windsor, the cause being suffocation on his own vomit after a night of heavy vodka consumption. The band announced their official dissolution on the 4th of December that same year, releasing a statement that said they could not continue without their dearest friend. It was a brutal, ordinary ending for a man whose drumming had sounded like thunder rolling down a mountainside, and it closed the book on the graveyard shift forever. Years earlier, in his book Hammer of the Gods from 1985, Stephen Davis painted a scene that has come to define the myth. A night at Chateau Marmont in Hollywood in 1973, an organ positioned in the corner of a room, and Jimmy Page playing dark, ominous chords from midnight until 4 in the morning while exotic dancers twisted around the instrument. That image of a man lost in his own private midnight has haunted every retelling of the band's story since, a perfect symbol of the hours they kept and the shadows they courted. There was always a more complicated truth beneath the darkness, though, and it extended even to their music, as the long dispute over Dazed and Confused revealed. The song, released in 1969, borrowed heavily from a folk tune of the same name written by Jake Holmes 2 years earlier, and Page eventually admitted the influence. Yet the band never credited Holmes until a lawsuit in 2010 forced a settlement for an undisclosed sum. The legal battle stripped away another layer of the legend, reminding us that even the most mystical art often has a very mundane paper trail attached to it. So what are we left with when the candles burn out and the hotel corridors fall silent? The rituals were mostly invented, the devil contracts were jokes, and the supernatural was just a stage prop for men who were, at their core, brilliant musicians with a talent for mischief and a bottomless appetite for excess. But the music remains, and it was never built on spells or sorcery. It was built on sweat, innovation, and a chemistry that could not be manufactured or sustained. Maybe that is the real secret of the graveyard shift. Not that something unholy happened in those hours, but that nothing supernatural was needed at all, for the men themselves were more than enough. We wanted them to be demons, but they were only humans who burned too brightly and too fast, and perhaps that is a far more frightening thought than any fiction we could invent. When you look back at the wreckage and the glory, ask yourself this: was the legend ever about what they did at night, or was it about how we refused to let them be ordinary?